Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. Should an aggressive country be held for the damages that they cause in a country that they attempt to occupy? Then should they be held accountable no matter what the reason actually was? This is a question that is being put against Russia, the Russian Federation, after its attacks on the Ukrainian state. They're arguing against such a resolution that is being proposed in the UN General Assembly. It is a valid question. There have been constant since before the actual invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. There have been bombings, there have been missile strikes, there have been lots of little things just to poke and prod at Ukraine and possibly even soften them up for military action long before the invasion actually happened. And that fact will be brought up in the UN General Assembly meeting that we're about to hear. Of course, Ukraine says that yes, they should be held accountable for the damages and should be forced to pay the bill for the rebuild of infrastructure, structures, schools, water systems, power, all those things that we've been listening to in the news that have been damaged and disabled. The question that the Russian Federation poses, what about the West? What about our record in the West as the United States, Canada, and Great Britain when they occupied a country? What about the state that Afghanistan was left in? Should the United States, Canada, be made to pay the bill for the military action that went on there under the guise of a war on terrorism? The same for Iraq. Should the Western countries be held to the same standard? Well, that is a very good question, and a question that should be put back to us, the people who actually vote people into these offices. Should we have to pay for the invasion to not help the aggressive government, but to help the people themselves? One of the things that I find interesting in this whole document is that should we be helping the people with humanitarian efforts, and that includes rebuilding infrastructure, bringing food, medications, power, water, all those things, It includes the same exact things, but it becomes a difference in how it's actually delivered. Should it be delivered to the government, or should it be delivered straight to the people? While an invading country should be held responsible for their actions as not only as a military, but as humanitarians. So, why don't we listen to the statements that were made on the General Assembly floor in the United Nations?
Members will recall that in paragraph 8 of its resolution ES-11/4 of 12 October 2022, the Assembly decided to adjourn the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly temporarily and to authorize the President of the General Assembly to resume its meetings upon request from Member States. In this regard, I should like to draw the attention of delegations to document A/ES-11/10, which contains a letter dated 7 November 2022 from the permanent representatives of Canada, Guatemala, the Netherlands, and Ukraine to the United Nations, to the President of the General Assembly, requesting the resumption of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly. I intend to conduct the proceedings of this meeting in accordance with the rules of procedure of the General Assembly and the past practices of its emergency special sessions. The General Assembly will now resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. In connection with this item, the Assembly has before it a draft resolution issued as document A/ES-11/L.6. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine to introduce draft resolution A/ES-11/6/L.6.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun, is written in one of ancient scripts. It is true, isn't it, that we have seen all these before. A country choosing to invade another, bringing death and destruction, impacting millions of people, undermining the very core of international security. The world fighting back and holding the perpetrators accountable. We have indeed seen this before. Let me quote one official. Large territory of our country was occupied by the enemy that destroyed entire cities and villages, turned into ruins enterprises, power plants, railways. That is why we believe it to be a moral right of countries that were subjected to occupation to receive compensation. End of quote. This quote does not belong to a Ukrainian official. Neither is it recent. This statement belongs to Comrade Vyacheslav Molotov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, It is striking how closely this statement describes that Ukraine is facing today. Large territory of a sovereign state under enemy occupation, entire cities and villages destroyed, enterprises turned into ruins, power plants destroyed. Of course, no material loss compares to the deaths and suffering of the people in Ukraine. 77 years ago, the Soviet Union demanded and received reparations, calling it a moral right of a country that has suffered war and occupation. Today, Russia, who claims to be the successor of the 20th century's tyranny, is doing everything it can to avoid paying the price for its own war and occupation, trying to escape accountability for the crimes it is committing. Russia will, however, fail, just like it is failing on the battlefield. We have indeed seen all this before. There is nothing new under the sun. 32 years ago, Russians once again clearly stated their position on reparations when one state invaded and occupied another. Responding to the consequences of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the UN Security Council adopted a series of resolutions, including Resolution 687, establishing a commission and a fund mandated to deal with any damage, loss or injury arising out of Iraq's unlawful invasion and occupation of Kuwait. Following his vote in favor of the resolution, Soviet Ambassador Vorontsov stated, and I quote, "The requirements of the resolution adopted are aimed not only at restoring justice, but at issuing a serious warning to all those who might be inclined to embark on the path of aggression, occupation, and annexation," exactly what Russia does today. The Soviet ambassador also added, "The adoption of this resolution provides the necessary conditions to restore normal economic relations in the region. The speedy elimination of the consequences of the ecological crisis and compensation for the damage which has been caused to Kuwait and its people." Thus, with 14 votes and one measly abstention, the United Nations Compensation Commission was born. A true success story. UNCC completed its mandate in February this year, having paid out over $52 billion in reparations to the victims of that war. Russia has tried its best to destroy Ukraine in a very literal sense. From day one of the full-scale invasion, Russia has been throwing bombs, missiles, shells of every kind at Ukrainian cities and villages, targeting everything from plants and factories to residential buildings, schools, hospitals, and kindergartens. We've all seen images from Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, Mariupol, and Izum. Russia has been destroying Ukrainian roads, bridges, and railways. Russia has demolished almost half of Ukraine's power grid and utilities in the past months alone, leaving millions of Ukrainians without power, running water, and heating on the eve of winter. Accounts of atrocities committed by Russians in the occupied territories, murder, rape, torture, forced deportation, looting, they all speak for themselves. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to leave their homes and seek shelter elsewhere. Ukraine will have the daunting task of rebuilding the country and recovering from this war. But that recovery will never be complete without a sense of justice for the victims of the Russian war. It is time to hold Russia accountable. We have seen all this in this very chamber. What has been done we ask to be done again. We've seen the UN General Assembly pass by consensus a resolution adopting the basic principles and guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. Let me quote, "Adequate, effective, and prompt reparation is intended to promote justice by redressing gross violations of international human rights law or serious violations of international humanitarian law, Article 15. We have seen the UN General Assembly adopt by consensus a resolution commending draft articles on responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts that stipulates that the responsible state is under an obligation to make full reparation for the injury caused by the internationally wrongful act, Article 31. We have indeed seen it all. We're not asking for something we've not seen before. We are meeting here today in the setting of the 11th emergency session of the UN General Assembly within the Uniting for Peace framework designed for instances just like this, when a country like Russia abuses its veto power, a veto power that came with the seat it's illegally occupying of the Soviet Union in the Security Council. Russia prefers impunity to accountability, and when it comes to the process at the Security Council, it only knows two things: lies and veto. And yet we will hear from Russia very soon that the General Assembly is not competent to address a matter like this. It will be yet another lie, yet another attempt to diminish and subvert this body of the United Nations, yet another attempt to tell you that you do not matter, and that yet again will be nothing new. I have recently recalled the words of King Hussein of Jordan, pronounced from this very rostrum in 1960. Let me quote from him again. "It is needless to affirm that the United Nations presents the only hope of peace and freedom to humanity. This is of major significance to all the small nations of the world, yet almost from birth the Soviet Union has sought to destroy the United Nations, to hamper its deliberations, to block its decisions, and by rowdy tactics and petulant walkouts to demean the reputation of the Security Council and the reputation of the General Assembly." End of quote. This is exactly what Russia is doing now. Having blocked the Security Council, the Soviet successors are trying to quiet the General Assembly. The UN should no longer tolerate this. Right now, there is yet another opportunity to send a clear signal to Russia and anyone else who ever considers using force to withdraw internationally recognized borders. Russians and their cohorts will try to make you believe that by this vote we are dividing the world into blocks and bringing it back to the times of the Cold War. They will claim that we ask the member states to take sides in the conflict. We in no way ask you to pick sides today. We are confident that you are all on the side of the UN Charter, its purposes and principles, and on the side of international law. Instead, it is the Russian Federation itself, which since its very appearance in the UN 31 years ago, has been perpetually committing acts of aggression against sovereign states. It is the Russian Federation which is threatening the mechanism of international security and undermining the fragile stability achieved after World War II. In fact, it is Russia that is to be blamed for dividing the world. The proposal in front of you today is a proclamation that Russia must be held accountable for its violations of international law in Ukraine. It is reaffirmation of the need of a concrete mechanism for reparations that will breathe life into this proclamation. It is a call for the member states to come together and build legitimate international infrastructure to deal with the consequences of Russian aggression against Ukraine, record evidence of atrocities, and preserve a hope for justice for millions of those whose lives have been changed forever by imperial neo-colonial ambitions of a small ruler of a large country. This proposal is not about Russia alone. It will work for the benefit of all those who are being threatened now or might be threatened later by use of force. Our response should be appropriate and should avert any aggressor from the temptation of starting a war. This is the issue we are resolving today. Mr. President, this proposal is built on the principles of multilateralism, as we call on all states that share the values of the UN Charter to participate in further steps to establish the mechanism. Ukraine is committed to a transparent, impartial, and objective process that will be managed and overseen by the international community in order to avoid even the slightest perception of bias. We have every intention of continuing to cooperate with the United Nations and its bodies in this process. We greatly value and appreciate the invaluable work of the Secretary General and the Commission of Inquiry adopted by the Human Rights Council. We hope for cooperation with UNESCO and UNEP to help assess the damage to the historical and cultural heritage of Ukraine and its environment. A vote against this proposal will be a vote in favor of impunity and lawlessness. A yes vote will mean that there is a faith in international law, that the global architecture so painstakingly built after the Second World War will remain, and the United Nations can stand to watch over international peace and security. It is a signal of hope for justice and an important first step towards accountability. A step towards such wars never happening again. Ukraine is seeking peace. The preconditions for any negotiations outlined by President Zelensky are clear: restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, compensation for damage caused by the war, prosecution of war criminals. This resolution will bring us closer to this goal, and we must take this leap forward without delay. This session is an opportunity to reflect on this and decide in which world we want to live. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. I give the floor to His Excellency Mario Adolfo Bucaro Flores, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Guatemala.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting and resuming this 11th special emergency session of the General Assembly of the United Nations as a follow-up to the impact of the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Once again, we meet in order to discuss one of the most important crises at the global level, whose impact is unprecedented. Guatemala was happy to join as co-facilitator and co-sponsor, together with the delegations of Ukraine, Canada, and the Kingdom of the Netherlands, to present to this General Assembly the draft resolution entitled Furtherance of Remedy and Reparation for Aggression against Ukraine, contained in document A/ES/11L6. We have supported and presented this draft resolution based on our own convictions as a country that is profoundly peaceful, but also a country that recognizes that through dialogue, negotiations, reparations, and peaceful means that provided under international law, differences between states can be resolved. We're a country that in our history experienced a long armed conflict, and therefore we acknowledge the importance of peace and respect for human rights. We have presented this draft resolution for the consideration of this Honorable General Assembly in the firm belief that this initiative is a step towards reconciliation among the parties. Considering that the resolution includes civilian claims, it's an important step towards peace and post-conflict recovery, and the recommendation of the establishment of a mechanism for the registration of damage and possible reparations. This is a very essential step. As a country that strongly believes in multilateralism, we're convinced that this Honorable General Assembly has the mandate and authority to approve this resolution as set out in Chapter 4 of the United Nations Charter that we have all endorsed. The language of the draft resolution is very carefully drafted so as not to exceed the authority of the General Assembly. This language is based on prior decisions of the General Assembly in the sense that the Russian Federation has committed an act of aggression against Ukraine in violation of Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. With this in mind, we respectfully request all member states to support this initiative because it is the right thing to do, and to vote in favor of this draft resolution for peace around the world. Mr. President, standing here in front of this tribune roster, co-sponsoring this draft resolution, I can't fail to mention the importance of an early reform of the Security Council adapted to modern times. Today, we're considering this draft resolution because the General Assembly cannot remain paralyzed or inactive in the face of the Security Council on this topic and other topics that affect international peace and security, and consequently recognize that humankind requires unity from all of us today. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Guatemala. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, the prominent representative of Ukraine who spoke earlier from this tribune quoted many, but he didn't say the main thing about the resolution, so please allow me to rectify this and cover up this gap. The draft resolution which is submitted to the special session is a classic example of a rules-based order wherein a narrow group of states is acting not on the basis of international law, but rather is trying to consecrate something that is illegal and is using for that purpose the authority of the General Assembly and is positioning the General Assembly as a judicial body, which by definition it is not. And the flawed nature of this initiative is obvious. Legally speaking, the provisions of the draft cannot withstand any criticism. They are legally null and void. They are an attempt to legalize something that, from the view of existing international law, cannot be legalized. At the same time, the co-sponsors of the draft cannot but understand that passing this resolution will lead to consequences which will, like a boomerang, come back to them. These countries boast about how committed they are to the rule of law, but at the same time they're flouting its very semblance. The draft resolution provides for the creation of a so-called international mechanism for reparation for damage, and then thereafter it's a technical matter, because this mechanism will be created by a group of countries which themselves will decide how the mechanism is to function. In other words, the General Assembly is suggested that the General Assembly gives a carte blanche to create a body whose features and functioning is something that most of the people present here have no idea about. And these countries will, on their own, determine, or to be more specific, appoint the guilty parties and the amount of damage, the ways to be compensated, etc. The UN will play no role in this process because the proposed mechanism is suggested to be created outside of the UN, and no one has any plans to account to the General Assembly for its activity. Let me underscore here that most of member states will have no right of vote or any control at the time of establishing the mechanisms or when it's functioning. We have no doubt where the funding for the so-called damage compensation will come from. The West is doing everything it can to provide a veneer of legitimacy for its work so as to start spending the frozen or actual fact stolen Russian Federation assets amounting to billions of dollars. They have for a long time wanted to unfreeze the assets, but not so as to return them to its rightful owner, and not so as to spend them on helping Ukraine, but rather so as to fund their own constantly growing weapon supplies to Kiev and covering the debts for the weapons already supplied. Thereby, the West is trying to draw out and worsen the conflict and plans to use the Russian money for it. And the decision of the General Assembly is needed for that, as a screen to hide this open robbery. Such a development can only increase tension and instability in the entire world, whereas beneficiaries will end up being the Western military corporations. They have already made billions of dollars on weapon supplies to Ukraine. Let me underscore here, neither the General Assembly nor any other mechanism can annul sovereign immunity, which state assets have under international law. The countries which support a General Assembly decision on it will become implicated in illegal expropriation of sovereign assets of a third country, and implicated in yet another instance where the GA is exceeding its authorities in the interests of the West. Do the countries of the developing world want to have anything to do with that initiative? We think that most of them think this is ludicrous or even insulting that the Western countries decided to demand reparations rather than pay them out, because the scenarios with the theft and spending of sovereign assets is being put forward by the very states which have a very rich record in looting the rest of the world. And I refer to the centuries of slavery, oppression, colonialism, and neocolonialism, military aggressions and interventions, blockades, unilateral sanctions, and shameless siphoning of natural resources from occupied and oppressed countries. But the proponents of the initiative are trying to make sure everyone forgets that, and they're just pushing the Ukrainian topic forward. The countries of the West never considered reparations as a way of atoning for their own sins. More than that, for 2 decades they blocked any discussion in the 6th Committee of the General Assembly or the development of any kind of international instrument on the accountability of states for international illegal acts. They remembered that concept just now when reparations all of a sudden became to their liking as a useful instrument to loot yet another state. If this resolution passes, this will have systemic consequences for the UN, and we call upon member states to realize that and to vote against the draft. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, colleagues, good morning. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, as well as Georgia, Liechtenstein, Monaco, and San Marino align themselves with this statement. Mr. President, the General Assembly is called today to take action on the draft resolution entitled Furtherance of Remedy and Reparation for Aggression against Ukraine. While the title of the resolution explains its purpose and what it intends to achieve, maybe some more background may be useful. I will explain why we believe the resolution is necessary, what it does and what it does not, in order to dispel any misconstructions, including some that we've just heard from this podium. First, why do we support this resolution? The answer is straightforward. Aggression has occurred. On 2nd of March this year, this General Assembly, with an overwhelming majority, confirmed that the Russian Federation committed an aggression against Ukraine in violation of Article 2.4 of the Charter, an internationally wrongful act that hits at the core of the UN system. People around the world are watching as innocent civilians are killed as a result of deliberate targeting, as infrastructure, hospitals, schools, homes are destroyed every day. Destruction is overwhelming. Damage inflicted on Ukraine is huge, and it's only growing bigger with every day that this war rages on. Under international law, the responsible state is under an obligation to make full reparation for the injury caused by its internationally wrongful act. In order to prepare an orderly process, such damage need to be properly registered in the first place. Accountability means that costs move from the victims to the aggressor. There is no question of whether Russia should pay. It's rather a question of when and the amount. Second, what does this resolution do? The resolution merely recommends the creation by member states and Ukraine of a register of damage. That register will serve as a repository of evidence of all types of damage. There are precedents for this, as we all know. The resolution also recognizes the need for the establishment, in cooperation with Ukraine, of an international claims mechanism for reparation for damage as a second step. Rather than charging the domestic legal system of Ukraine and other states with a potentially very high number of individual litigations, a centralized and specialized system would be more appropriate. In our view, an international claims mechanism would provide for legal certainty and procedural fairness. Russia must be held to account for its wrongful acts and wanton destruction. This is key if we are to uphold a rules-based international order. This is not about the West against the rest. This is about global respect for international norms. Third, what does the resolution not do? The resolution does not establish the register of damage, nor does it create the reparation mechanism. These instruments will be created at a later stage by member states in cooperation with Ukraine. There are no costs for the UN system stemming from this resolution, and no costs for anyone else apart from Russia itself, who must bear responsibility for its wrongful acts. Mr. President, we must stay the course in order to shape history. Russia's denial of taking responsibility for destruction and damage adds insult to injury. Let me conclude by saying that every country, regardless of its size, might, or location on the globe, enjoys the right to document crimes committed against its population, territory, environment, or cultural property in order to secure their proper investigation. Each state can also work together with other states or the international community to set up an efficient international mechanism to deal with the reparation claims arising of such crimes. Accordingly, the resolution essentially supports the path to justice. Today it is Ukraine, tomorrow it could be someone else. We therefore call on everyone to vote in favor of this resolution. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union.
So here it is, the long and short of it is exactly this, that responsibility by all nations is important. All countries should be held responsible for their actions and how they interact with other countries. as far as war is concerned, here is the bottom line. When the guns are silenced, the cannons go down, the planes stop dropping bombs, the survivors of the war on either side, in general, have to sit down and talk and work things out anyway. Why don't we put the guns, the arms, the munitions, the bombs, the warplanes away? Take the funding that would supply all these things and put it to a better use. Maybe a more scientific use. Maybe a use that would help distribution of food so that all have food and medications. There's a lot better use for the funding. There's a lot better use for the technology that built these war machines than war. Thank you for listening to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I am your host, Michael Clogs. Please do subscribe when you have the chance to whatever platform you're hearing this on. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.